Evening, Steve. How are we, mate? I was going to say, I think it might just be me and you tonight. According to that, there's 4 people watching. Anyway, hopefully more will join in. Yeah, how you doing, Steve? I hope you're doing well, mate. The weather's a bit shit. It's just horrible. It's cold. It's wet. It's windy. But you know, it's Britain. What do we expect? Right, tonight's feast of nostalgic. Well, maybe that's the wrong word to use. It's not nostalgic, because this programme we're going to watch next isn't one I can remember from back in the day. We've been playing a lot of the computer programme, making the most of the micro. All these ones with I can't even remember the name of the guy that the BBC made. These were all early programmes. So I thought to try and change it a wee bit, we'll look at something slightly different. Though I think this is going to be just as kind of vintage as the previous stuff. So the delectation I've got for you tonight, now just bear with me a little second, because when I click on this, it's going to start playing the last video or song, whatever it is I had, so just bear with me. Oh, hang on, that's actually good. I've not enabled it, which is good. Excuse me. Right. Where are we? There we go. Retro program. Right, the one we're going to watch now. I've never even heard of this before. I don't know whether it was in the UK, the US, whatever. Don't really know. And it's called the Mighty Micro. Just with that title, you know it's going to be an early one. So this is Mighty Micro Episode 1. I think it's about 24 minutes long. See how we get on. We might watch 2. By the way, in case you notice, my stream started and stopped. It's because OBS crashed right from the off. I couldn't actually get it off the Mamemeister page. So this is the Mighty Micro. Steve, do me a wee favour, since you appear to be the only person actually watching this. Could you let me know how the balance of my voice is against the actual volume of the thing? That would be super spiffing. Right, here we go. Mighty Micro Episode 1. Hang on, two ticks. You see what's happened here? Hang on. Webcam video, unlock that. There we go. There I am. I don't know why that was like that. I must have been messing about with it or something. Right, there we are. Lock that and let's continue. Let me know how the volume is, please, Steve, if you don't mind, mate. I don't even know. I can't hear anything as yet. Can you hear anything? Right. Right, the volume is really low. I can hardly hear that. What's the volume like for you, mate? Can you hear it okay? I can hardly hear it. Don't know why. Yeah, I can. I've got my low. Aye, that's weird. I'm going to stop after a second. So I'm really low as well. Why is that? I don't actually know why that's the case because my headphone is turned up. Microphone is turned up to full device volume. Try that again. Still really low.
For millions of years, man was only a minor figure on this beautiful planet. An animal competing for food and living space in a world which had both in abundance.
Hopefully that's
but even as his generations migrated across the globe, still the world remained largely unaware of his presence, until he invented the first tool. Through the use of tools, man extended the range and strength of his arms, giving him the capability to mold his environment to suit his needs. From this moment on, his climb to power on the planet accelerated. And then, to clinch the matter, there came the machine, amplifying the power of his muscles 1,000-fold and more. In one great surge, man became at once the supreme ruler and the supreme despoiler of his planet. The Industrial Revolution changed the face of the world at a breathtaking pace. Hills and valleys which had remained unchanged since the beginning of time were torn apart in the quest for mineral wealth. It's easy to forget the scope of this change,
assuming my voice
mainly because
is
we're not really a part of it anymore.
Steve.
But to get an idea of its scale, it's only necessary to look at countries that were directly affected by it. Britain, Germany, the USA, which enjoy amazingly high standards of living. And compare this with the countries of Central Africa and Southeast Asia, which were never touched by it. And now we're on the brink of the computer revolution. It'll run its course not in a century, but in 1 or 2 decades. It's an era when we'll amplify the power of our brains many, many times in the way that the machines of 100 years ago amplified the power of our muscles.
Yeah, I don't know what's going on, Steve. I mean, I've got my USB headset turned up to the max, volume-wise. So I don't know. I have no idea. I don't know what's going on with that. Don't know if I can change anything. That should all be No, listen, it doesn't really matter as long as you can hear. Can you hear the program? Hopefully, you can hear that all right.
Most people know by now that a microprocessor, or a chip as it's often called, is an incredibly tiny computer. And there's a general feeling that it represents a dramatic breakthrough in technology. But few realize just how dramatic. Commercial computers have been around for about a quarter of a century, and they've increased in power and efficiency, shrunk in size and cost on a scale which is almost incredible. If the same advances had taken place in the motor car industry, today you'd be able to buy this Rolls-Royce for £1.65. How many miles do you think it would do to the gallon? About 3 million. And if you were interested in miniaturization, which you wouldn't be, you could get
Check
3
out
of
the
them on a
hairy
pin's
chest.
head.
What the hell is he all about? See the eye candy
Most
for the
people's
ladies,
reaction to
possibly.
this is fantastic, but so what? Who wants all these cheap computers anyway, and what possible good can they do for me? To understand that, we need to know something about what a computer is, what it does, and what it can and will do. We're not going to be talking a lot of incomprehensible technology, which fortunately isn't necessary for one to understand the significance of the microprocessor. All one needs to know is the basic principle of how a machine can count.
5 little monkeys playing on the shore.
Good evening,
One
Blackson.
went sailing and then there were 4. 4 little monkeys.
As soon as man achieved even the simplest form of communal society, he needed to count.
And then there were 3. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Now, the essence of counting is that you represent numbers of amounts by physical things. Simplest of all, you could use your fingers and your thumbs. And in all probability, this is why we count in tens. Anyway, the real point to grasp is that one can represent numbers or amounts in the form of physical things, whether they're bits of rock, fingers, or in the case of the abacus, beads on a frame.
Only time I ever used an abacus was at primary school, and that was it.
When one writes down a number, one's doing much the same thing, and using particular rules, one can even calculate. As human society became more and more complex, the need for calculations grew, and those few people who were trained in accounting found themselves overloaded with work. The first person to actually try to do something about this was the French philosopher Blaise Pascal, who as a young man had watched his father, who was an income tax collector, toiling through the night on endless calculations.
Pascal,
now, what Pascal realized was that it ought to be possible to build a machine to add and subtract automatically by constructing a set of interlocking gears, each of which had 10 teeth to represent the numbers 0 through 9. And this is actually a copy of Pascal's device. It's really enormously clever. You dial in the numbers that you want to add, subtract, and so on, and lo and behold, the answer comes up in these windows.
Hope you're doing all right.
The principle is rather similar to the way a car's mileometer works. One wheel revolves slowly, completing a circuit each tenth of a mile. As it does so, a lever comes out and hits an adjoining wheel, advancing it 1/10 of a revolution. The first wheel goes round again, advances the second a further tenth, and so on. The total number of revolutions, or the distance travelled by the car, is recorded in a window at the front.
Obviously, with this live stream.
So that's the principle of
That's been
Pascal.
happening in,
It really
just
should have
over a week's
worked, but
time.
actually it didn't catch on. Now, there are a number of reasons for this. One is that it was rather an expensive device to build. Secondly, it was mechanically unreliable. It's also been said that the accountants and clerks at the time objected
Absolutely
to it
delighted to
because
get,
it was going to
Jeff
put them out of
Minter.
work.
Hopefully he'll turn up. That could
By the
happen,
early
he might not
19th
turn up.
century, with the advance of science and international trade, it was obvious that the resources of orthodox counting and calculation were becoming strained. And in 1810, one man decided that something would have to be done about it. His name was Charles Babbage, and he was the father and the prophet of the computer age. Babbage was an eccentric gentleman scientist of a kind that it's almost impossible to find today. he became obsessed with the enormous problem facing the compilers of scientific tables at the time. That's tables to calculate tides, astronomical observations, structural
quite
engineering
hard to
problems, and so on.
Drop in any witty comments because it's quite a dry subject we're watching, but I think it's interesting.
He set out to build a giant calculating machine. He called it the difference engine, made out of an unheard of number of cogs, wheels, and interconnecting parts. It would be capable of solving differential equations, which was a task far more elaborate than anything that had ever been attempted before. What Babbage realized was that once a machine was capable of performing one complex type of calculation, there was no reason in principle why he couldn't design a machine to solve any kind of calculation. And he used punched cards of the kind that Jacquard used to control the weaving pattern of his machines. These machines, incidentally, also provoked industrial action on the part of the weavers of the time, the Luddites, who feared that they would be flung out of work as a result of his invention.
No doubt there would have been an enormous fuss if Babbage's analytical engine, as he called his universal computer, had actually been put to work. Well, a team of expert mechanics did set out to build part of it, and a careful study of Babbage's intricate designs suggests that in principle it would have worked. But despite the injection of his own considerable fortune and the help of numerous friends, including the beautiful and talented mathematician Ada, Countess of Lovelace, the device was never completed.
So what went wrong? Well, Babbage himself ultimately lost heart in the scheme because he'd realized that the workmanship of the time just wasn't up to the task required of it. And even if the whole system had been put together, there would always have been some part that was simply out of adjustment.
Evening, Neil. How are you, mate?
The trouble was that the method of calculation he was using, decimal, meant that all the components had to have 10 teeth, and that each of these had to interlock with hundreds of others. The thing was simply too complex to have worked.
In 1871, Charles Babbage died, a disappointed man. He'd had a glimpse of a future that he would never see. He'd been considered to be so remarkable that when he did die, a leading surgeon was commissioned to examine his brain to see if it differed in any way from that of other men. Well, he couldn't find any differences, but they preserved his brain for posterity. And here it is.
Oh, bloody hell.
And here, sitting on top of it, is a glimpse of the stunning future which he missed. A tiny computer, no bigger than a fingernail.
10 years or so before Babbage's death, the United States government were facing a major problem. At that time, they decided that a census should be taken every 10 years to keep track of the nation's expanding population. But so many immigrants were arriving in America that the authorities were still dealing with statistics 7 years old. Obviously, a new counting method would have to be found, and at last someone came up with a brilliant idea. Herman Hollerith dramatically proposed the data should be counted by machine.
The Hollerith system used the same kind of card method that was actually used to control the Jacquard loom. What you have is a special card punched out specially for each individual, a hole in a particular position, meaning a particular detail about that person. For example, that hole there might be their age, that their sex, that their occupation, that their ethnic group, and so on. All this was pre-punched, of course, one card for each individual. The card was inserted in this gadget here. Now, this consists of two parts.
Gadget.
Up on the top, an array of needles, below a bath of mercury. Now, when this is lowered, most of the needles, of course, get blocked by the card, but some actually pass through the holes, make connection with the bath of mercury, make an electrical connection, and score up on these clocks up here. So let's see it go. That's right. They score up, and in fact, a little compartment opens up, and you drop in the particular card. This must be the first mechanical sorter, I suppose. Well, the whole thing was a great success. The American census was completed in record time, and Mr. Hollerith went on to build up a big business based on this and other forms of mechanical sorting and counting machines.
By the First World War, automatic calculators were in widespread use, but they were still all decimal mechanical systems, barely more than elaborate versions of Pascal's original invention. And things might have gone on developing slowly in this way had it not been for one man. When Hitler plunged the world into a second major war, he unwittingly set in motion the computer age. For their military communications, the Germans had invented a machine called the Enigma, with a virtually uncrackable code system.
Haha, that's what they thought.
So, at a Buckinghamshire country house, a top-secret team of British scientists and mathematicians were given the order to beat Enigma. The first mechanical computers they used were far too slow, until someone had the idea of using electronics, and it was this that was to prove the turning point for the computer revolution. The basic unit was the valve, or an electronic switch, a device which even then could switch on and off thousands of times a second. And with this came a new counting system, binary. These are the kinds of numbers we're all familiar with, but they're difficult and time-consuming for a computer to handle. Instead, it uses only two numbers, 0 and 1. Because a computer is simply a vast collection of electronic switches, all it needs to know is when a current is off or on. 0 equals off, and 1 equals on. It may seem a long-winded way of going about things, but don't forget that these switches are operating or counting at tremendous speeds. The computer equivalent of our everyday numbers may look rather odd, but it was the use of this binary or two-digit system that really launched computers as we now know them. The British Colossus computer was the first and the most successful. It cracked the Enigma code without the Germans knowing it, and some people believe helped to win the war. The British, in fact, developed some very successful computers. But soon the Americans, with their huge defense budgets coupled with their mighty industrial muscle, began to move inexorably into the lead. Progress was slow, and computers were still cumbersome, unreliable, expensive, and dependent upon the temperamental and power-hungry valve as their basic unit of operation. And then, in 1948, scientists at Bell Laboratories invented the transistor.
The Atari logo.
For most people, a transistor is a little radio set, but that's a misuse of the word. A transistor is actually a tiny switching circuit which can be used as the basic calculating unit of a computer, and it's very much smaller and more reliable than a valve. Here's a valve, and this is a transistor. In fact, this is rather a larger transistor, and it's a characteristic of them that you can make them extremely small, so small that you need a microscope to see them. In fact, on this chip, there are 10,000 transistors.
Transistorized computer power allowed people to use them for all sorts of applications, and among the first were bank accounts. Then followed wages slips and stock control. In fact, any number of complex or routine calculations became possible. But despite all these advances, they were still essentially big, expensive and rare beasts, unlikely to have any impact on the world at large.
80 possibly, 81 maybe?
And then, in October 1957, came the launching of the first Russian satellite, Sputnik 1. It astonished the world, and they followed it almost immediately by the launching of a dog, Laika. This was all possible because they developed huge booster rockets, far more powerful than anything the Americans had or would have for at least a decade. And for a while, it looked as if Soviet science had triumphed.
That's awful.
The Americans, on the other hand, who'd been overconfident of their technological superiority, had a succession of humiliating failures.
It's a bit you never see.
And it was here, on this now deserted and decaying site, that a series of disastrous launches led them to totally rethink their space program.
This orbit is 11119er.
They had too much to lose in terms of national pride and international
Yeah, I'm
prestige
guessing that pure
to
dog
fail
didn't
again.
come back.
So in 1960, President Kennedy announced that billions of dollars were going to be spent in putting a man on the moon by the end of that decade.
I see R2. It looks
Well,
somewhat
we all know the
smaller from
outcome
here.
of that and how sensationally and convincingly the Americans won the space race. But what's less well understood is that the triumph of beating the Russians to the moon was by no means the most important spin-off.
In the early days, when their rockets were relatively puny, the Americans had to think small, miniaturizing their electronics in the most inventive and radical way. The Russians could have put the kitchen sink into orbit, and judging by the design of their spaceships, they did so.
The Americans didn't have the boosting power, but they ended up with the
It
microprocessor.
always amazes me. I've never really gone back to the moon in the last
Once
30
again, the
years.
huge American industrial potential showed
I
its
think the
muscle,
technology we've got
bringing
now
mass
that,
production methods to the new generation of
they've been there.
miniaturized computers.
Or not been there and gone back. I don't know, but
Gradually, the density of transistors that could be packed onto a single chip of silicon began to rise dramatically. First, just 10, then 50, then hundreds, then thousands, then tens of thousands. Today, we're talking about the equivalent of hundreds of thousands of transistors, and on the drawing boards are plans for chips with 1 million switching components. This means that today's pocket calculators, costing only a few pounds, are doing the same job as the early computers,
pounds, I'm
costing
alive.
hundreds of thousands more.
The first mechanical
Goodies.
calculators could perform 1 or 2 calculations or operations in a second. The first electronic ones, literally thousands. Then came the transistor and speeds pushed up to 1 million a second. And today we've got computers that can perform 1 billion operations a second easily.
Do you know what a billion is? Well, it's 1,000 million, but most people don't really have any idea what that means. Suppose we have an eccentric billionaire who decides to give £1 billion away. He hands over £1 to each person,
What's that?
working at a rate of 1 every 10 seconds, and for an 8-hour day, 5 days a week.
Oh, I see.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Now, pretend that he'd just this moment given away his last pound. When do you think he gave away his first? At the time of the Silver Jubilee, perhaps? No, earlier than that. What about the first American moon landing? No, earlier. Well, the Queen's coronation? No. Hitler's invasion of Poland, perhaps? No. The First World War? No, even that's not early enough. Queen Victoria's funeral? Back further. The Battle of Waterloo?
What?
No, the billionaire would still have been at work.
Oh, the billion there.
The Great Fire of London? No, he'd have been handing out pound notes through the flames. The Battle of Hastings in 1066? No, still further back.
Well, I'll put you out of your misery.
the billionaire would have handed over his first pound on July the 24th, 652 AD. And this little microprocessor is capable of calculating 1 billion times a second.
That's pretty mental, actually.
Now what this amounts to is that we're already making computers which will operate millions of times faster than the brain, that will store masses of information in an area hardly larger than a pin's head, performing many of the tasks that the brain can perform, but which can be rushed off the mass production line at a cost of a few pennies each. Now, no one should doubt that this will give us the capacity to change our world. In the next 5 programs, we're going to be looking at some of these changes, at the effects on employment, on leisure, on education, on politics, even on the future of our society. Join us to find out what these changes will be and whether they'll be for the better or for the worse.
I'm Lawrence Moore, the producer of The Mighty Micro. Sadly, just as we were completing these films, our writer and presenter, Dr. Christopher Evans, died. A scientist in his own right, he had the knack of being able to convey often complicated scientific ideas simply and directly, as is shown in his book, The Mighty Micro, on which these films are based. All of us associated with these programs would like to dedicate the series to him.
Christ, I never saw that coming. God almighty. Right, that was quite interesting, actually. Who's for one more, I think? Yeah. I think we'll do one more. Just give me one little second. So that was the Mighty Micro episode 1. And let's roll the next one. Right, okay. That's bloody sad. That was a bit of a sad ending to a entertaining half hour.
Throughout the 1970s, the average working day has been about 8 hours. In the earliest societies, a man and his family had to work just about all their waking hours simply to provide enough food to keep alive. Later, through the use of tools and more advanced forms of technology, they freed themselves from this absolute dependence on the environment, gradually increasing their wealth and reducing their need to work.
Anything wrong with that, however.
But one doesn't have to go back to the Stone Age to make this point. Just imagine the lifestyle of a coal miner in the middle of the Industrial Revolution about 100 years ago. Working under vile and dangerous conditions for up to 16 hours a day, sometimes with his children scrabbling in the depths alongside him, he was still only able to earn enough to eke out a bare existence for himself and his family. Little wonder that Karl Marx was later to cry, "Workers, arise. You have nothing to lose but your chains." Compare with his successor today. Still a tough job and no mistake about it. But working conditions and hours which should have seemed like a dream to the miner of the 1820s. A warm, comfortable home, children properly fed, educated and clothed. A personal motor car, electronic devices of incredible sophistication in the home, holidays in the sun in remote parts of the world. This isn't to point out how lucky today's miners are, but rather to indicate the stupendous improvement that's taken place in their standard of living. And all of it due to the Industrial Revolution, the coming of the machines, and the vast affluence that they've brought. The mechanical muscles which the Victorians invented and put to such good use triggered off the Industrial Revolution, which in turn led to a huge expansion in the wealth of those societies which were touched by it. This, despite the fact that many people once feared that machines would decrease employment and lower living standards. The problem was that people couldn't see what those workers displaced by the machines would do. Who would employ them? Where would they get their money? Much the same arguments are being applied today to the microprocessor revolution.
The microprocessor is a machine with a difference. It's a tiny, tiny computer, which, unlike other machines, amplifies the power of men's brains, whereas previous machines amplified the power of their muscles. Unlike the machines that made the Industrial Revolution, they're extremely cheap to mass produce. They also use up virtually no raw materials, hardly any fuel, and they're totally non-polluting. In fact, they can be used in absolutely enormous numbers, all over the place, and at very little cost. Through space projects like the Voyager, with their vastly increased computer power, we're beginning to map the surface of the planets. And all this signifies far-reaching changes in our technology.
An excellent example of the dramatic pace of change is if we take a common contemporary object like this relatively cheap watch. Costs about $50 all over America, £25. Now it's got several functions, a bleeper alarm, a stopwatch, a liquid crystal display and all that. This in itself is amazing, but perhaps the most remarkable thing is if we go back to, say, the first Apollo lunar landing in 1969, which one thinks of as very advanced technology and also as fairly recent technology, the astronauts on that flight would simply have failed to understand this watch. They wouldn't have known how to operate it, and they certainly wouldn't have had any idea how it might have worked. I think it's very difficult to think of a better example of the dramatic pace of change.
But on a more basic level, the chip is now appearing in supermarkets. In America, all products are now marked with special stripes, allowing them to be scanned by a laser beam. At the cash desk, the goods are simply passed over a laser scan device connected to a computer. It makes the cashier's job faster and more efficient. It registers the product sold, the price, and updates the store's stock account. And one day, in the not too distant future, the man from the gas or electricity board will arrive at your home, not simply to read your meter, but armed with his portable, pre-programmed mini-computer, will calculate your bill and hand it to you there and then.
Thank you very much.
Brush your hair before you appear on TV. What the hell?
In schools, the power of the chip will begin to help with personal tuition.
Just tear it the way it is. It'll be all right. I don't need any more paper.
Okay. Right.
Whilst in hospitals, the chip at your bedside will help the doctor with instant diagnosis.
Check. I wish doctors would wear bow ties like they did back then.
Industrial uses have now brought the power of the microchip onto the shop floor. Here, a skilled operator literally teaches the robot to do the job, with the microcomputer recording every action. The action replay, now minus the operator, carries on as before, and this kind of application is ideal for hazardous, repetitive, or simply unpleasant work. The enormous power and flexibility of the microprocessor works for the architect and the town planner. They can instantly see the effects of their development on the environment. But its extraordinary versatility for many people poses a threat. In the newspaper world, the Times dispute brought this whole issue to a head. Here at the Nottingham Evening Post, this technology has been in use for some years. The technique is word processing.
There's
Instead of the
Margaret
story being
typing up.
typeset in metal by teams of craftsmen, the reporter
she's
now
smiling
types the
like that
story directly into a computer. Simply by touching the keyboard, she can alter her spelling, grammar, and in fact
Simply
anything
by
she likes.
touching the keyboard.
Once the story is complete, it's automatically stored in the central computer. When he needs the story,
there's a
the
lot of
editor with his
spelling
own terminal
errors in that one,
calls it up, adds his own
The good
changes,
old ashtray
headlines,
in
and so
the
on.
desk in the British office.
The edited version is then typeset into normal typographic layout and printed in the usual way. The point about this technology is the speed and flexibility which allows for rapid changes to the editions during the day. In fact, this paper prints 9 editions daily, compared with the 2 or 3 published by our national papers.
Yeah, that
Inevitably,
hat's
this
really
is going
gonna
to
stop
put
him getting
people out of
injured.
work, and the effects are likely to be far-reaching. So the problem facing us now is the creation of completely new industries where the microprocessor functions positively for a working society. In fact, the range of brain-like tasks the microchip can perform is going to increase steadily in the years ahead, like transposing your favorite tune into a musical score.
Your favourite tune? We're gonna
But
spoil
what
it if
are the
anyone knows
facts
what that
about
was.
the microprocessor?
The guy said
In
he
what way
died.
will it actually affect
He actually
employment in
died
the
after
coming
the shoot
years?
one.
Well, the first word that springs to everybody's mind in this context is, of course, robots.
The hell?
The robot has a prominent place in science fiction literature and movies. Basically, it's a
Waste
man
of money,
made
that
out of
really
meccano
makes
parts, which stumbles around doing man-like things, flashing its eyes and
Man-like
engaged in
things.
stilted, tinny conversation. Apart from hints that it has special strength or unusual weapons, it's generally looked upon as a kind of cumbersome, rather inferior version of Homo sapiens. In fact,
Man-like things.
entertainment apart,
Going to the
it's hard to
pub
think why anyone would ever bother to make one.
It's a stuffy nightmares.
But that's really based on a misunderstanding of the meaning of the word robot. To understand what we mean by it,
Never really
we
get
need to
people
realize
wearing
that there
watches
are
upside
essentially
down. Is there a reason for
3
it?
types of machines.
Excuse me.
This is the simplest kind. It's all muscle, an extension of its driver's muscles. And it can only work as long as he's here to guide it.
There's your PPE, mate.
Even
No
if
high
you switch
vis,
it on,
no bloody
it won't do
helmet.
anything sensible without a human in its seat.
He's cracking a smile. I don't know that he's just gone straight from the disco to the workplace.
This is the second type of machine, a programmable one. It adds its own mechanical muscles,
Looks advanced.
but it can also go through a sequence of actions according to one or possibly a large number of predetermined patterns.
Jesus, next time you complain
But
about your
although this
PlayStation
looks very
4
clever,
taking ages to
the
load,
machine
just
itself is really
remember this.
very unintelligent. It's a dumb machine, to use computer parlance. This sequence of
Parlance,
actions it goes
whoever
through
uses that word.
may be complex, but it will go on doing them, however inappropriate they may be.
Printing
Indian
pictures of your
roving
wife or
chamber.
something. Yeah,
The
that's
blocks
okay.
coated with icing, cooled and decorated.
Here's a good example. Remember this marvelous film about industrial relations, I'm All Right, Jack? Remember where Ian Carmichael visits a factory making chocolate bars?
This is my favourite machine.
Oh, I see.
I say, is there anything wrong, old man? Oh, why, that's pretty overwhelming, isn't it? Come on, round the other side.
Come on, hurry up, son.
And here we have the coated blocks, soft, milky, delicious. All ready for stamping with a walnut and a cherry. Now all that remains is to wrap them, pack them, dispatch them. There we are.
Though this may seem like an example of automation in its silliest form, you'll notice that the machine isn't all that stupid. For example, it gives the bowler hat more than one cherry and arranges them neatly into a pattern.
Seen everything, my boy?
In the movie, it's just a joke, of course. But this would really make it a robot rather than a dumb machine. the essence of a robot is that it not only performs mechanical tasks more easily or more rapidly than a human, but it also guides itself to some extent, modifying its behavior according to what it senses in the world around it.
Okay.
Okay, investigate it and resolve it.
He'd not get out of the road if it.
Sure. Okay.
It's fantastic. I want one. Where can I buy one?
It's robots like this, performing tasks which have hitherto been reserved for specially trained and skilled humans, that will kick the computer revolution into being. By increasing productivity and efficiency dramatically, they'll accelerate the trend towards a more affluent, less work-dependent society.
Yep, we'll all go out with 3-day weeks.
The economic consequences of this are enormous. Countries which get in quickly on the robot revolution will reap tremendous rewards. Those who lag back will become steadily less competitive, in just the way that those countries which missed out on the Industrial Revolution remained locked into medieval standards of living.
Some countries are already committed to massive investment in industrial robots, and amongst them is Italy, with the robot-built Fiats using this technology to its utmost.
Sinister ways.
Any industrialized country that wants to maintain its living standards in the 1980s, let alone the 1990s, is going to have to look at robots and their possibilities quickly. But now, let's consider one of the most sensational consequences of the microprocessor revolution, the disappearance of money.
This pound note and this dollar bill are useful bits of paper because they allow us to buy the things that we want. But that's all they are, really, just bits of paper. A printed record of the fact that their owner has contributed something to his society.
In primitive societies, people simply exchange one form of goods for another. But barter doesn't really work where people have nothing to exchange but their specialist skills. To meet this need, money came into being. Beginning as chunks of precious metal, money developed into tokens, then coins, and finally paper banknotes.
The banknote is still only a piece of paper with writing on it. And for thousands of years, of course, that's been the only way of making a permanent record, but it's a very inefficient one. All the paper's got to be bought, then it's got to be printed, then it's got to be distributed and guarded, and in due course, replacements have got to be issued. And it's also extremely vulnerable to theft. In the past few years, the computer has appeared and provided a completely different and far more efficient approach. What this amounts to is that instead of making a mark on a bit of paper saying £1, we make an electronic mark 1,000,000 times smaller in a computer's memory. And we indicate alongside it, also in the form of a minute electronic signal, who owns the sum of money recorded. The record, electronic rather than physical, sits there until someone wants to look at it or wants to arrange for it to be transferred elsewhere. What happens now if one wants to transfer money from one business to another is that computer A changes its own record appropriately, sends a message to computer B, which makes its own amendments. It's as simple as that. No mail, no danger of theft, and the transaction completed at the speed of light and at a fraction of the cost.
No chance of theft.
The earliest experiments in using the new electronic money, for that's what it is, actually began about 20 years ago when those funny symbols appeared on the base of checkbooks. Hardly anyone realized that they were the first steps in the move to a totally cashless society.
Yep, we're there now.
The next step came with credit cards, and many of you will have one or more of these. They too are a sort of printed record of your wealth, but unlike coins and notes, they're not interchangeable.
stupidity.
How would you like to pay, sir? Access
Oh,
card,
Atari
please?
2600.
At the moment, the card really just identifies its owner. He wants to make a purchase,
Games
so
there,
the
I didn't
assistant
actually
writes
see
down the
what games he
details,
has. Wait a minute.
and the document is popped through
No,
the
we
post
can't
in the
actually
usual
see that.
way. Hardly worth the effort. Why not use a cheque or good old-fashioned cash? Well, that was just a halfway house. The next step involves just you and a distant computer. You punch in your personal code number. It checks to see if your card is valid and if there's enough money in your account. And if there is, it okays the deal. And in this case, pays out in traveller's checks. The whole transaction is concluded in seconds. Throughout the 1980s, the process already underway will gather pace, and by the 1990s, money as we know it, and as it has existed for thousands of years, may be totally redundant. There will be some surprising consequences, some good, some slightly sinister. Bank raids crop up pretty frequently these days, and crime flourishes because hard cash is easily transferable and difficult to trace. But the shift from cash to electronic money will gradually reduce this kind of thing, because
there'll be no
electronic
crime.
money will pass not from hand to hand, but from computer to computer. However, this is leading to some funny trends. In America, police are already beginning to notice a shift of muggers' attention from the wealthy, whose pockets are likely to be lined with treacherous credit cards, to the poor, who paradoxically are more likely to carry cash.
Rich and the poor.
Soon there won't even be any point in the theft of goods or precious items. What you're going to do with them when you've stolen them. They won't be exchangeable for negotiable, anonymous cash. Amazing though it may seem, by the time we get to the 1990s, the crime of theft, as we know it today, may have vanished. For some time, coins will probably still circulate to allow small transactions to take place. But even this use will die away as people find the carrying of cash less and less convenient. Already in many cities, public transport and telephones require tokens purchased in advance. But for anyone who doubts the remorseless spread of the credit card, take a look at this New York taxicab. Okay, fine. This'll do nicely. How much is that?
$8.25, sir.
Okay, can you give me American Express?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Sign it, please.
Get to sign it. Thank you very
sir.
much. Okay.
Yes, sir. Thank you. Have a good day.
God, that is overacted.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
The net effect of this should be to make everyone, criminals accepted, of course, a good deal wealthier, and certainly make life a whole lot more pleasant. And all because of electronic money. But will it be totally beneficial? On the surface, one might think so, but there are one or two smoke signals which one shouldn't ignore.
Credit cards may be very convenient for both the user and the banks, but they also have a funny way of keeping tabs on what you do. Wherever you go, whatever you buy, the card pins you down, pouring information back into its central computer. And soon, cards will not just be a convenience, but an absolute essential. Increasingly, we're moving towards a cashless society.
Vous avez fait faim? Oui, j'ai
These French stores have been directly linked to a local bank. A specially issued card can be used in neighborhood shops, and your account automatically debited. So, if your bank balance isn't up to par, you could be in trouble. This principle is already being used in a very advanced way at Citibank in New York, where you have a choice of services, all relayed to the computer through a small keyboard and television screen. You insert your magnetic card, tap in your personal code number, and the computer asks you which services you require. In this case, he wants to deposit some money. The computer recognizes the customer and automatically updates his account.
In the computerized world of the 80s, and in particular the 90s, it's going to become extremely difficult to buy anything, to go anywhere, even to do anything without
really
one's own
early.
form of personal identifier. Chances are this will come in the form of a credit card with perhaps a built-in microprocessor which recognizes its owner somehow and makes it virtually useless to anyone else. This personal identifier might even come built into a watch, or possibly even a signet ring.
All very convenient and useful, of course, provided that we don't mind the computers knowing where we are and what we're doing at just about any moment. But are we sure that we aren't going to bitterly resent that kind of perpetual computer surveillance, no matter how benevolent it is?
It's mental.
Well, that's the kind of question we're going to have to face up to in the 1980s. And there are obviously political and social questions of equal magnitude as well. Join us in the next program to consider some of them.
Yeah, there we go. Excuse me. Right, okay, folks, that was whatever it was called. I can't remember. That was actually quite interesting. Interesting how wrong they were in most of the examples. Anyway, listen, that wasn't a massive turnout tonight, but you know what, as long as there's a couple of people still watching it, I will continue to do it, because it's the probably only time I actually get to watch these programmes as well. So anyway, folks, listen, I will be along on Friday for a live Friday Waffle. Until next time, guys, as always, thank you very much for watching.